So, welcome everyone to our event on Ukraine's post-war economic outlook. I'm Jeremy Zettelmeier, the director of Bruegel. We have a spectacular panel here. We are going to be focusing in particular on the IMF's program with Ukraine, which was approved by the board, I believe, on the 31st of March of this year, after a long process of design, negotiation, soul-searching on the side of the IMF. The IMF had previously supported Ukraine following Russia's invasion twice, but these were both so-called outright purchases. So they were essentially drawings, one-time drawings of Ukraine that either were not associated with any conditionality initially, or had very light conditionality, and as such they were of much lower volumes. But the End March program is a full-fledged, as I used to call it, the IMF, and they still call it, upper credit tranche program. It's a 4-year program, it's ambitious, and it involves a fairly large volume of money, 15.6 billion US dollars. So with me here to discuss this, and I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order in which they will speak, is Uma Ramakrishnan. She's Deputy Director in the European Department of the International Monetary Fund. She's not actually the mission chief for Ukraine. She oversees the mission chief for Ukraine, so she's very senior indeed. She runs a whole portfolio of countries. She's responsible for several countries in the remit of the European Department that includes Ukraine, but for example also includes France, where she just came from. So this is how the IMF keeps its staff intellectually agile, by exposing them to different countries. And so, you know, Uma and I know each other very well. We were colleagues in the Uma's previous job, which was in the Strategy, Policy and Review Department of the IMF, where she was in charge of lending policy, which is probably the most important job in that department at the deputy director level. And I, at the time, was in charge of debt policy. And these two things go very closely together. So we worked together on several important program cases. And, you know, she has a long career at the fund. Before that, she was the architect of a very important program with Egypt. And she was an architect of important facilities, so elements of the IMF's lending toolkit, like the flexible credit line and the precautionary and liquidity lines. So we're super pleased that she's here with us. So next, again in the order of speakers, we have Dmytro Boyarchuk here, who's the executive director of CASE Ukraine. So CASE Ukraine is one of the premier think tanks in Ukraine, and its remit goes beyond Ukraine. As I understand it, it came out of the macro reform project of HIID, the then Harvard Institute for International Development, in the 1990s. And it specializes in economic research, policy analysis, and forecasting in the region. And so CASE Ukraine has a recent study out on long-term reform priorities for Ukraine. That study came out a few weeks before, I think in February, right? About a month and a half before the IMF program. And so one of the interesting things that we're going to look at is how those long-term priorities fit with the current program, which after all is a 4-year program. So it should be getting into some of the more structural issues that are important for the longer-term future of Ukraine, and Dmytro is going to talk about it. And then, last not least, we have Annika Erichgaard, who is a Director for International Economic and Financial Relations at DG ECFIN in the European Commission. So she is the IMF's counterpart on countries like Ukraine, but not only Ukraine. She also has a lot of experience with that region, because before that she was head of unit for economic relations with EU neighborhood countries and for the macro financial assistance program, which is the EU's financial instrument for assistance for non-EU countries. And I read you were also head of the economic and financial section of the EU delegation to China at some point. So that's a very good one. That's a very interesting one too. Great. So Annika will give us the EU's perspective, and particularly what I will be interested in asking is essentially the division of labor between the EU and organizations such as the IMF, and why that division of labor optimally entailed a large IMF lending package to Ukraine, as opposed to having most of this lending done by the EU. So let's start. You can, for those that are joining us online, as always, you can participate by asking questions or making comments on Slido, and the key word on Slido is Ukraine. Uma, take it away. You have about 10 minutes.
Thank you, German. Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for hosting this event, and to Bruegel for having us here. So in terms of the IMF engagement in Ukraine, what we have now is not, it is unprecedented in the context of the current war, but we've had a very long-term engagement with Ukraine. In fact, just before the war last year, we were already in a standby engagement with Ukraine, and we were just about to complete the second review of that arrangement when the war broke out. And so we need to sort of go back very quickly to the drawing board to see how do we continue our engagement with Ukraine in the context of the war. So as we were thinking through strategy of how to move forward, the immediate response was, of course, as you mentioned, emergency financing under our rapid financing instrument, which is available to member countries who qualify under certain conditions, which would include large balance of payments need, inability to negotiate a program in the period of time, etc. So that was the first disbursement that was made to Ukraine, and as German said, that is an outright purchase, meaning that there are no program conditionalities associated with such a purchase. But in the context of, even while we were providing that purchase, the IMF remained engaged with the authorities in thinking through what policies might be appropriate in the context of the war, and helping them think through FX restrictions, capital controls, exchange rate policy, etc., the stuff that we normally do. So we had not, even though there was no formal program per se with them, staff and the authorities continued our engagement throughout the process. And so the second part of it was, and we were also coming under pressure both from international community and from the Ukrainian authorities with a request for a program, because there was a desire to have a monitoring framework and to be able to have the usual macro framework that, which is what we provide for countries, and to be able to undertake policies under that context, and also to be able to provide a financing framework that would be needed for Ukraine, because the external financing needs were very large. So while we were thinking through a strategy for how to go forward with the upper credit tranche program, or a fully fledged IMF supported program, we went through a second step. So the first step was the first emergency, and then we had a second step where we created what we call the food shock window. And in order to because at that time the food and fertilizer crisis, etc., also unfolded, and many countries were affected by the crisis because of the grain export shortage that was occurring in Ukraine, and therefore rest of the world there was spillovers to the rest of the world. So we created a food shock window both for importers and for cereal grain exporters, and therefore under the food shock window, we again gave Ukraine another emergency financing. So that was another 1.4 billion that we gave to Ukraine, but that was also an outright purchase. But what we did in the second step was that we also created a new instrument called PMB, or the Policy Monitoring with Board Involvement. And what that meant was, in order for us to be able to engage with Ukraine in an upper credit tranche program, we needed to make sure that this was a country in active war, and we needed to make sure that we are able to support the country in a more traditional program, because more traditional fund programs are rigorous and they require a certain capacity to implement. they need some data, for the member to be able to provide data so that we are able to monitor what is going on in the country. And so in order to make sure that Ukraine would be ready to undertake a upper credit tranche program, we also, our board management approved a PMB, and that was a non-financing program, but with all the traditional features of an IMF program. So it had quantitative targets, it had structural benchmarks, and so it was a way for us to estimate and assess whether Ukraine would be able to undertake a full-fledged IMF program. And if there was a strong performance under the PMB, it would pave the way for a UCT. It would be one of the sort of gives us comfort that the country has the capacity to implement a fully fledged IMF program. So that was actually a critical part of our engagement, and so it was in December last year that the PMB was approved. And in the meantime, while the PMB was in play and Ukraine was implementing the PMB, we were also thinking through, okay, so if Ukraine does implement with a strong performance the PMB, it would pave the way for a UCT. And what would a UCT look like for a country in active war? This was unprecedented. The fund has not lent to a country in active war. So this was not something that we had a rule book on. And so we needed to think about how would we go about doing this. Why would this not be part of, sort of our traditional lending? Because this was part of an active war, as I said. And under our Articles of Agreement, lending is for restoring or resolving the balance of payments problem and for restoring medium-term external viability. Now, for a country in active war, it is difficult to assess that at the end of the program period, that the country would have fully resolved all its balance of payments problem and the medium-term viability will be restored. Why? Because even if Ukraine were to have done met every single target, done every single benchmark, completed every reform, there are still aspects of the country's economy that are outside its control. And therefore, it was difficult to know that even if they completed the program to the best of what was designed, there were still exogenous factors that were not within the control of the country nor within control of policy design per se. So therefore, it was not a traditional program because we had to see how to handle that uncertainty. So this is when we had to think of what would be the best way for us to engage with the country in what we call exceptionally high uncertainty of war. And so in that context, we had to come up with, thinking through what would be possibly a new policy that would be needed to engage with countries with exceptionally high uncertainty. And so even if the PMB paved the way, we would still need to think of what would be the engagement and the framework under which we would be able to lend to Ukraine in the context of a war, but in a way that we are assured that the balance of payments will be resolved and the debt will be sustainable. And the third part of it was with adequate safeguards to the fund. So there is always this capacity to repay the fund. And usually when we do a sort of normal IMF program, a country resolves the balance of payments problem, and that paves the way for it to repay the fund. And that's sort of the way in which we assure that the capacity to repay exists because the country solves the balance of payments problem, its fundamentals are stronger, it has the ability to then repay us. So in the case of Ukraine, we had to think of newer ways on how we would be able to achieve what is required under the Articles of Agreement and to ensure that the safeguards for the institution are maintained and are met. So it is in that context that we had to introduce a new policy that we called financing assurances for lending under exceptionally high uncertainty. I'm happy to elaborate on it further, but the primary idea was that there were two aspects to it. One was, in order to ensure that debt is sustainable, because if debt is not sustainable, the IMF cannot lend to a member country. And in the case of Ukraine, in the context of an active war where we were not able to sort of have a clear baseline where we could attach a very high probability of success because of the ongoing war and what I explained, the exogenous part of, the exogenous, truly exogenous aspect of this engagement. So we had to think of what would be the best way to therefore ascertain debt sustainability. So we had to come up with a policy where we had to receive assurances from the official bilateral community that they would be taking what we call a flow measure and a stock measure, or two-part debt sustainability, debt relief process, which would help restore debt sustainability, where the flow would be for initial debt relief, but with a commitment up front that there would be a stock relief at some point before the program ends that will help ensure or support debt sustainability. So that was something that was not there in fund policy before, and we had to introduce that in order to get what we call the specific and credible assurance in the context of this engagement. And the second part of it was financing assurances in order to have safeguards for the institution for the capacity to repay. Given that this engagement is in the context of a war, and there are so many uncertainties, exceptionally high uncertainty, we had to figure out what would be the best way to ensure that the capacity to repay could be assured, because, as I said, the balance of payments may not be resolved in a typical baseline. So we had to seek assurances, the policy would seek assurances from a group of creditors, and these group of creditors had to be part of the financial transactions plan of the IMF, and they also had to be in good standing in terms of the track record of multilateral architecture. So we needed a group of creditors to be able to assure us that the capacity to repay the fund would be assured by them. So that was the second part of the policy reform that was needed to move forward with the fully fledged IMF program with Ukraine. And the additional complexity was this was not just enough for the baseline program, which is typically how we design a program, is based on a baseline. But there was no central scenario for Ukraine that we could say this would be the baseline and this is how things are going to evolve. So the policy required us to think of a downside scenario also. So we had a baseline scenario and a downside scenario, both of which had to restore debt sustainability so that if things deteriorated or if the war persisted, for example, and we were not able to sort of return to a more traditional situation, that debt would still be sustainable and the capacity to repay was still assured. So there were layers of complexity in the program that had to be thought through. And also we had to get through and all of these the policy had to be implemented. And in addition, we also had to get some of these assurances from various creditors to move forward. So with all that done, we got the program approved in March 31st. And the program itself is an interesting program because it's a 4-year EFF. That's the duration of the program. And it is a package of 115 billion over the 4-year period, with 15.6 billion coming from the IMF. And we are taking a two-phased approach in the program, where the first phase of the program, until the war winds down, and we assume that this would be sometime in the middle of 2024, is our baseline assumption. And this did not come out of thin air. We had various discussions with war experts from various institutions, and sort of we came with the assumption that war could end. And in the downside scenario, we are saying that the war will not end in mid-2024, and it might last into 2025 and possibly towards the end of 2025. So that's where we are calibrating the downside scenario. So we expect that the first part of the program is designed to stabilize the macroeconomy, and once the war winds down, we expect the second half of the program would entrench more the structural reforms and many of the policy priorities that would be needed to restore external viability, which would be required under the fund program, and that is where some of the accession measures would also come into play, and I'm sure Annika can talk more on that. So that's broadly where we are, and the focus of the program is on 5 critical areas, of course, on fiscal policy, monetary and exchange rate policy, financial sector issues, debt sustainability, as well as governance and growth issues. It is very important for Ukraine to maintain a tax base that it's able to sustain, and so there's a lot of focus on tax policy, tax administration, and on the monetary and exchange rate side, the authorities are committed to not providing monetary financing, and which is why the external financing package is so big, because we want to make sure that the independence of the NBU is maintained even through this time. So the first review staff level agreement has been reached, which is we expect the board meeting to happen later this month. And what is interesting is the economy has performed better than we had expected at the time of approval. At the time of approval, we had expected that the growth would be in the -1 to +3 range, and we are upgrading that to +1 to 3 range because the activity has been better than expected, and the growth in the first quarter came out better than so that's positive. Inflation is coming down rapidly. The May number was about 15.6 compared to 25 earlier, so that's a rapid decline in inflation. FX reserves are rising rapidly, but that's related to the external financing and the timeliness of the disbursement that has been coming. So overall, and they have also met all the quantitative targets and the structural benchmarks associated with the first review. So overall, I would say it's positive, and we are headed in the right direction. Maybe I stop there, and we can pick up on some of the more issues.
Yeah, maybe one quick follow-up. So, can you remind us how big the output collapse was last year? Something like 28%?
29%.
29%. So given that, aren't you overly cautious in the sense that 1% may be a good floor for the baseline, with a catastrophe somewhere below that, but clearly the upside must be much higher than 3%, no?
Upside, there are upside and downside risks. I'm not disagreeing at all, and there is chance that the growth could be higher, but we are still in a situation. War is active, and we just heard that the counteroffensive has started. So we will need to see. We don't want to go too far in terms of our expectations. We'd rather be conservative until we see how things play out. Okay,
Dmytro, what do you think of this program? Does it hit the right areas? To what extent is the outer part aligned with what you think of as the top reform priorities in Ukraine?
I had this slide. Can you put it on? Yeah, actually, if talking about the IMF program, it's what we need. The country, if we do not have such kind of support from the IMF, from other international players, I would say that our path would be much more challenging, to say it very mildly. So this program is really essential, really critical for us. But here I want to make one point. When we talk about saving or stabilizing Ukraine, it's one story. But we also want to talk about generating growth, turning off the engine of our growth, and it's a bit different story. This question we actually try to address in our report, and I want to draw your attention to this graph. What you see there, it's a rule of law index by the World Governance Indicators, by the World Bank. This bunch of lines above is rule of law index for such countries as Poland, Slovak Republic, Baltic states, those countries which demonstrated impressive reform results in 90s. And this line below in negative zone is rule of law in Ukraine. What this graph tells to us? Firstly, that over the last 30 years, the situation with rule of law in Ukraine has not improved much. Here I want to stress that we had huge progress, at least good progress in many other areas of economic reform. I would say in almost in all areas of economic reforms we had substantial progress, but not here. With rule of law, we're only starting for now. This is the first point I want to stress. Second point, you can see that in early 90s, Eastern European countries which have been demonstrating impressive results, they already have functional institution. Maybe it was weak, maybe it was not perfect, but they can rely on this institution and they were able to build on this fundamental to deliver really impressive results. It's not the case with Ukraine. As you see, even in 2020, the situation with rule of law is much worse than Poland had in early 90s. And here is the question. If rule of law in Poland and Baltic states was weak in 90s, can we say the same for Ukrainian stance of affairs in 2020? I would say that it would be not correct to diagnose the situation in this manner. In our report, we call it suboptimal and unreliable, because you cannot rely on this institution when building your policies, when building your economic policies. And actually, we have this story that even the authorities do not rely on this institution, in particular when building their tax and customs administration. What is the key question in this story? How Ukraine can develop and prosper on those years while the rule of law is under construction. We perfectly understand huge attention to this story, huge attention to the rule of law. We understand that reform will be moving on. Already we have many steps. But at the same time, we understand that it will take years and years to make this institution functional. How we should turn the engine of economic growth when the critical ingredient of success of Western countries, critical institution, is not in play. And we try to address this question in our report. And one of the answers we have, actually the report is very concentrated, it has a lot of different things there, but one of the answers that we suggest that in economic policy there should be simplification. Why simplification? Because when you have sophisticated legislation, it's much better than simple legislation. It addresses very specific issues very accurately. But also it generates this kind of trend that, for instance, taxpayer and state body can have different views on the same situation. In those cases, you need service of judicial system. And if your judicial system and law enforcement system is not good, you are in a problem. So you need to minimize those cases when the state and taxpayer can differently interpret the same situation. And as a specific proposals, for instance, in taxation area, we claim that such practice as presumption of guilt in tax administration and customs administration should be revised. What is presumption of guilt? I'm very uncomfortable when I claim this to people in Western communities, because if you didn't ever experience this, you could not even imagine how it works. The closest example is a visa process. When I want to come to United Kingdom, I'm applied for visa because I'm suspected to have intentions to stay there illegally. and I have to file documentation to prove that this risk is minimal. This is how it works with every single transaction in Ukrainian tax and customs administration. It's very arbitrary. It allows intervention at every stage of operation of businesses. It creates huge discontent among businesses, how it works. But the state, as I mentioned, the state does not trust judicial system and law enforcement system. How it works in Western society. Fiscal discipline is built on inevitability of punishment. If you break the law, you know that with very high probability you will be punished. It keeps everything working in line with some discipline. In Ukraine, it's differently. If you are successful in tax evasion, law enforcement bodies and judicial system will never, very low probability that you will be caught and punished. That's why the state developed this kind of system based on the presumption of guilt, where every taxpayer, almost at every transaction, you need to file documents to prove that you do not have any intentions to avoid tax payments. This system probably helps collect taxes, I'm not sure, but it's for sure it's very disruptive for economy. It's just one example what I'm talking about, simplification. And unfortunately, when we talk about international organization, it goes beyond the radars of international organization, because it's up to national governments to define how to keep this fiscal discipline. And this story is one of the most pain makers, and where this incentive probably when the IMF talks to different representatives of Ukrainian businesses, you can hear different proposals like abolish VAT, other new stories, but this is the main troublemaker, this is the main pain.
Super, thank you very much. Very important point. And I actually think it is within the radar, should be, of program conditionality, because it has wide implications for incentives of business, but even incentives of public officials. No? So if public officials are subject to, a blanket threat that they may be prosecuted for reforms because those reforms allegedly harmed the state, and that is defined in a narrow sense of reducing revenue, then there are not many incentives to do the type of reforms that may actually be prescribed by international organizations involving privatization, things like that. No, and if I'm not mistaken, we actually have some ongoing cases of this type in Ukraine now, hitting people that arguably were good faith reformers. So I think this is a very big problem and should be addressed by the EU and the fund. But beyond this specific issue, Annika, what are your views, and more generally, how do you and the IMF collaborate, and how do you see the relative roles?
Thank you, and thank you for setting up the panel, the discussion, and it's good to be here. The EU works very closely with the IMF on a whole range of issues, and certainly when it comes to the countries neighboring the EU as such, where we have quite also close engagement with the partner countries. So I think we have, to some extent, a work share with the IMF in general, which is particularly strong for our neighborhood. Just like the fund has had many programs on Ukraine, so have we, and we have to some extent overlapping and reinforcing reform efforts that we are seeking, and to some extent we have a work share when it comes to fiscal critical reforms, the whole macro framework that Uma was talking about. For us, it is typically, for any macro financial assistance operation, a precondition that there is a satisfactory progress with a dispersing IMF program. And every single word matters here, that it is satisfactory, it is dispersing, and it is IMF. Because with that, you know that there is a framework in which the country has committed to engage, committed to address what is the root cause of their problem, what generates this balance of payment problem, in a way that leads to, by the end of the program, with a high likelihood, a satisfactory outcome where debt is sustainable. So overall, I think we have many years of a splendid track record. As such, it doesn't mean that we have not had problems, particularly because the world very rarely evolves as we plan it to do. But by and large, and in terms of institutions working together, I think this works very, very well. On Ukraine, again, it has been a spectacular pleasure to work on it, but it has also been very painful. There's no doubt about that. So since 24 February last year, we found ourselves with a war at our doorstep that maybe military strategics could foresee, but I think as a humble economist, certainly we could not, and understand what was going on. The SBA IMF program that was there was cancelled on the request of the Ukrainians for an RFI, very good, and we found ourselves with an IMF or with an MFA operation that was not backed by an IMF program. And what do we do? And what we could not do, for sure not, was to say, well, sorry, we cannot help you. This was not the time for Europe to say we are not standing by Ukraine. Certainly not. But then you find yourself in a situation where, should we then not have even harder conditionality? Absolutely. To some extent, yes, because then we don't have this underlying framework to rely on. At the same time, the country is at war. What can you do? What can you expect? So we did already, for the emergency financing we put in place in March last year, have conditions. The Ukrainians took actions on all of those conditions, but not enough. Should we then not pay out? Again, it's really a question of what is at stake. And so we did pay out, and we waived all the conditions. This is painful as such if you are a creditor. At the same time, politically, it's so obvious this is what you have to do. We went forward. We have struggled quite a lot on finding a sound way of doing this, of understanding our role also as a borrower on the capital market, while at the same time being a political partner and standing by Ukraine no matter what. This went well beyond what reasonably could be expected by a country to do, and we tried to fill our role as best we could, but it was a lot of learning by doing, and learning by doing when, imagine you are flying at 11,000 feet and you need to repair a wing. Well, that is how it felt. So we did things at a speed that we have never done. We did it in close cooperation with our G7 partners. Lots of discussions also with the IFIs, the IMF, the World Bank, the EBRD, the EIB, and we tried to be sure that we didn't lose any balls and that we did as best we could to be very systematic, to be as safe as we could, and to support Ukraine in a sound manner, trying then also to pick up on the elements you just made, for example. So we have also with the programs that we had, and we provided 7.5 billion euros last year in 3 different operations. We had reform conditionality that were on macroeconomic stability, what could and should be done, on the rule of law, on energy, and on structural reforms. And we have tried to make sure that they are, on the one hand, relevant, these are the areas, and at the same time feasible, given the ongoing war context. So the work with the IMF has been there all along at a technical level, and I think we have been a firm supporter of you taking a more active role, and we have talked a lot on how to do that, and fully understand also the fund's position of doing something that is even-handed and works then also across other countries. So we have been really grateful when the IMF came back and took sort of a leading role and took this role as an enabler, giving certainty to other partners that it is there and that if Ukraine is going through here, we are reasonably sure that at the end of the program, the country will be in a much better place, and we as its partners would have contributed to that. And we have certainly said that we are and will stand by Ukraine. There are numerous European Council conclusions to that end, but doing it alone was not ideal, and so having the IMF back with a fully fledged program was really desirable. The burden sharing as such is, we take roughly half of the financing needs this year with the 18 billion euro MFA operation we have in place, which is clearly more than what the IMF is doing as such in terms of monetary needs. But I would in no way undermine the importance of having the IMF program there. So as a burden sharing goes, having the IMF enables others to also come forward, and that makes it possible for the international community taken together to be there and support Ukraine in the long haul, because this is not just for this year or next year, for the long as the war is ongoing, but until reconstruction is sufficiently much underway so that the private sector can also come in. And this, I think, is really important. So the burden sharing element is not just EU, other donors, but EU and other donors benefiting from having the IMF there. And why? I mean, I think the critical thing on the why part is really the debt sustainability analysis. Can you do a central scenario for Ukraine right now? Well, just take the dam that was sort of now taken out, I guess is the form to use it. What is the impact of that? How can you construct a baseline scenario for a country at war? How can you do a forecast when you typically would have backward-looking time series that enables you to predict the future? I mean, it doesn't work. As an old forecaster, it just doesn't work. So you have to do it differently. You have to do scenarios. I think the central scenario is a cautious one, but it's by no means unrealistic. But what is realistic? I think having a downside scenario makes sense. I hope we also move towards having an upside scenario where it becomes more and more likely that we head toward a more stable development, at least in parts of the country. But given the drone attacks that has been extremely effective in place since October last year, even if Ukraine has been even more effective in taking at least most of it out, that we don't yet have that. It's also understandable. So in that respect, the IMF is such a central player to allow and ensure the rest of us some credibility and some reassurance, and that helps the broader donor context where the G7 countries and the EU is playing a fundamental role to get it off the track. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me try and see whether I understood this. I will try to summarize the argument. So having the IMF change its policies in order to be able to support Ukraine has a cost, right? Because it makes the IMF vulnerable to the accusation that it is not even-handed. So the change in policy is supposed to be even-handed exposed, if you wish, in the sense that once the policy is changed, other member states can also, other members, I'm sorry, this is EU terminology, member states, other members of the IMF can benefit from the new policy. But of course, the fact that it changed the policy was to help Ukraine, right? So there is in that sense a cost. So Annika, if I understand you correctly, you're saying the cost was worth it from the perspective on the EU because relative to the counterfactual of continuing with the previous modus operandi where the main show was a macrofinancial assistance program by the EU with conditionality, and the IMF's role was sort of supportive in the sense that it had its own program monitored by the board with its own conditionality, but was not a provider of big finance. So what is the big value added of changing from that modus operandi of last year to the new one where the IMF is in there with a full-fledged program? And what you're telling us, I think, is you're saying it's not primarily about the extra money. It may also be about the extra money, but it's not so much about the extra money. It is because if the IMF puts in the extra money, it starts doing things that it would not otherwise do in the previous modus operandi. And most important thing is to really worry a lot about debt sustainability in Ukraine and to ensure that debt relief is given in sufficient amounts, right? Both by the official sector and by the private sector. And it is that reassurance that once the IMF is in, adequate debt relief will be provided that has this catalytic effect and that helps draw in additional new money, right? And so there's no substitute for that additional service, if you like, that the IMF provides, and that additional service only comes if the IMF actually does an upper credit tranche program. That seems to be the argument. Is that correct, or did I mischaracterize this?
No, I think you were sort of roughly right, but possibly precisely wrong. I have to think about that one. I do think that the bilateral donors, be they private or countries, their willingness to engage in a debt relief, should that be needed, is absolutely essential. That could also come through the Paris Club. So in that respect, having an IMF program is stricto sensu maybe not essential, but I think it is part of the package. I think the two distinctions between the RFI financing that was done twice last year and the fully fledged program is distinct and important. Would it have been enough with a non-dispersing this monetary program? I saw that as a clear stepping stone towards a fully fledged program. So it's the catalyst effect of having the IMF on board with the framework, with the financing assurances, and with the debt sustainability analysis. So all as one SWIFT. The monetary part is not trivial, but it's not the key point. In that respect, I absolutely agree.
Zaduma?
Is on. Yes. So just to complement what Annika said, if we, in an emergency financing program, we don't need to fill the financing gap for the country, right? So we just give what we can based on the rules of the policies that we have, but we can leave the financing gap open, and we don't really need to play that catalytic role. Whereas in a fully fledged program, we cannot leave an open financing gap. And that's where it is important for us to bring all the players. And in this instance, EC was a very big player that helped to bring the money, then close the gap. And I think that was critical for giving Ukraine the confidence also that there is money flowing without them having to worry every week, every month of where the money is going to come from.
Good. Let's throw it open. Any questions from the floor? There are actually several. Actually, let's start with Paula. And can you identify yourself, and we'll go around the room, please, and keep it brief. We'll have one round and then common answers.
Paula Tama from Politico Europe. I wanted to ask about the conditionalities, because you have said in the absence of an IMF program, you had to be even tougher or stricter with the conditionalities, but at the same time, when it came to the disbursements, you had to realize that these were not fully fulfilled because of objective constraints on the ground, even though the Ukrainian administration certainly played up. And I wonder, going forward, one request that I have when I speak with the Ukrainian finance ministries and the authorities there is, could we just have one set of conditionality, please? Because with all of this multiplicity of donors, it's becoming difficult to keep track of what to do. You don't want to reduplicate. We have heard Dmytro speaking about simplification, the need for that. So going forward, we know that the Commission will prepare another MFA or similar type instruments. Will these be modeled on IMF conditions? Will they be stricter? What will it be in it? Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman in the back with the dark jacket.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Andre Hertel, SWP here in Brussels, German think tank. on international affairs. I have one question to Mr. Boyarchuk. How do you assess the reform capacity of the Ukrainian government in times of war and looking at a potentially years-long prolonged war? What can they really do on the lines you suggest here to enhance the rule of law? Then to the EU representative also goes with conditionality or along the lines of conditionality. You have mentioned the political imperative of supporting Ukraine currently dominates everything. So what about the conditionality levers you still have vis-a-vis Ukraine right now? And wouldn't the opening of accession negotiations provide the EU with more conditionality levers in the foreseeable future? Thanks.
Let me squeeze in an online question, also from someone at SWP, Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, but this from Berlin, Susan Stewart. This is one for Uma and very easy to answer. Was Russia somehow involved in the decision to grant further IMF support to Ukraine? And if so, how did Russia explicitly support or oppose the program? Okay, great. Heather, please identify yourself.
Heather Graby from Bruegel and Open Society Foundations. Thanks, very interesting. What are your expectations regarding the London conference on Ukraine, particularly this issue of a very prolonged period and potentially, frankly, no official end to the war? Because to end a war, usually both parties have to agree it's finished, and why would Putin do that? How to deal with this potentially lengthy period. And related to that, what kind of war insurance can be offered for foreign investors, so for the private sector, of various kinds? I mean, there are many different kinds of investors coming in, and quite a lot of companies have been asking about this. Could there be a specific war insurance program? How do you see the outlook for that?
Thank you, Heather. Question, the gentleman in the second row from the EP. Can you identify yourself?
Thanks a lot. I'm Stefano Spinaci from the European Parliamentary Research Service. My question is about the issue that was mentioned by the colleague from Case Ukraine. In particular, there's been a report, specific report by the European Court of Auditors about how the European Union funds that is being spent to fight corruption and other issues in Ukraine has been ineffective. The report is 2021. In 2022, the European Court of Auditors has said that also the money that is spent in Ukraine can have a material effect on a material error on the balance sheet of the European Union. I mean, how the accounts of the European Union are correct. The question is, should we take into account this or not? The decision is only political, or anyway we should address this kind of issue, and how this issue can create populism in some European Union countries. Thanks.
Very good. And go ahead, Marek, please.
Marek Nombrowski. I have a question to both colleagues from IMF and European Commission. I think it's not big public secret that appetite for especially institutional reform of the current administration was limited before the war, and the war economy, management and martial law didn't increase this appetite. It's very good that Ukrainians received more military aid and financial aid. Both are urgently needed. But when we think beyond the current situation, especially in the context of ambitions for EU accession, what is the strategy to increase this appetite for reforms and address really tough issue like rule of law, reform of public administration, rule enforcement, law enforcement agencies, this kind of issue?
Thank you. I think we are through. Maybe I want to add one other from the Slido, which is along the same lines. Ivan Vekirchik, can you tell us the main conditions on the program from the start till mid-2024? You may want to be brief here. And importantly, do you take into account money frozen outside Russia? So for the purpose of the financing gap, for the debt sustainability, that's an important question. Okay, so I would say let's do it in the same order as before. I've been asked to answer the question by our colleague from SVP in Berlin on Russia's involvement myself, so no one gets into trouble here. So my sense is, and what I know from being there, that on all decisions related to Ukraine, Russia has consistently voted against financial support in Ukraine. And as you know, and this is also largely public, Russia has taken the view that whatever negative spillovers the Russian invasion had on the rest of the world, food prices, energy, and so forth, were not so much because of the invasion itself, but because of sanctions from the West. So these are sort of consistent Russian lines. So Russia has continued to take part in board meetings, but has basically taken a very negative view of support for Ukraine. Okay, please, Uma, on reform capacity, IMF conditionality, money frozen outside Russia.
Yeah. Thank you, German. Great questions. On whether money frozen outside Russia is taken on board as part of financing, the answer is no. Certainly for the IMF, this involves very complicated jurisdictional issues which we cannot tackle, and therefore, it is not in our sort of mandate to be looking into those issues. So the answer is no. In terms of the various areas where we are looking into conditionality, I urge you to read the MEFP, which is a Memorandum of Economic and Financial Policies that the Ukrainian authorities have committed to, and there's a table there, a detailed table that goes through all the reforms. But just that gives all the details, but just from a sort of high-level standpoint, on the fiscal side, the focus is on making sure that the revenue is maintained and the tax base does not erode. Our colleague from Case Institute was talking about the martial law, and the question came about the rules from martial law and some of the tax reform measures that we are working on right now. And in fact, one of the measures that needs to be passed by the end of June is related to reversing some of the amendments that were undertaken in the context of the martial law so that the tax base is not eroded. So we are looking into some aspects where we are able to help and move the reform agenda forward. And then on the monetary and exchange rate, right, you will know that last year Ukraine pegged the exchange rate from a floating exchange rate, it moved to a pegged rate. And we are hopeful that in the second part of the program, once the war has wound down, that they will be able to get back to where they were in the pre-war in terms of their exchange rate regime. And so they are, there's a strategy that the central bank is working on how they expect to get there. There are a number of corporate governance and anti-corruption issues that are also in the program, and they are related to asset declaration of public officials, AML-CFT laws, establishing enhanced due diligence. It is related to SAPO. So there's a number of governance-related reforms, and of course in the financial sector there is a lot that is going on in terms of governance and oversight, and to make sure that that bank rehabilitation, once the war is over, is put on the right footing. So a lot of preparatory work is needed in that, and a strategy needs to be developed on that front. So there's a lot of areas in the first phase of the program that the authorities are committed to do, and we are working with them.
Great. Dmytro, reform capacity, governance, and so forth.
Okay. Actually, very, very good questions. I will start from the question related to reform of judicial system. I would say that we are in a situation of catch-22 position, because from the Western point of view, when you want to solve a problem, you need to approve a better legislation. But when legislation doesn't work, your better legislation probably would not lead to a better solution. When we have been thinking how to address this issue when we drafted our report, the proposal was that this traditional metrics of we approved the better legislation is not good for us. We need to develop or borrow some more advanced or better metrics, similar like this index of rule of law, to see what is going on. You know this, if you cannot measure it, you cannot manage it. So this is kind of situation. I would say that first of all, with reform of the rule of law, we need to have better metrics of measuring the situation. I know that there is some metrics in practice in European countries. In Ukraine, it's already in some basic, very basic level, some data collects, but it should be in more developed, in more like extensive form, and progress on this metric should be linked to funding. You said about funding capacities. Actually, I would say that it's not really a risk of corruption, because when you talk about Ukraine, it always pops up the point of corruption. It's a point of capacities. We have many channels which could be processing funding in a very efficient way, but those channels are not very powerful. They will be monitored by watchdogs, by civil society, etc. But if Ukraine, for instance, will need roughly 20 billions per year, we could monitor roughly, very roughly, I don't know the numbers, like to 5 billions per year. That's the point. That's, in my opinion, that's the main concern, because there are no even limited capacities of project managers. Professional project managers. That's the point of capacities. And for sure, if we pour 300 billions in Ukrainian budget, and you do not have absorption capacities, there will be a problem. That's commenting on your case about judicial reform and about spending capacities and Western support. About conditionality, very sensitive issue, very sensitive issue. First of all, while the war is running, I would agree that conditionality should be rather mild. But I would suggest to make a more like proper work to select on which issues conditionality could be strengthened. I do not see why the demand on rule of law should be lessened while the war is running. How rule of law is related to those developments in the front and the supplies of weapons. Why rule of law could not be more actively pushed with our government. And about another point about conditionality, you know, I'm working with Ukrainian reforms already for 2 decades. And I can say absolutely for sure that reforms, painful reforms, take place only in exchange for funding. No pressure for funding, no reforms. Everything what is written in the IMF, if there is need in money, will be implemented. That's how it works. No, there should be no illusion. Only in exchange for funding.
Thank you, Dmytro. Annika, you round it off, please.
Thank you. That's an honor and a challenge with time being minus.
That's correct.
But time being minus, I'll try to be as focused as possible. I don't think, indeed, and I will pick up where you ended, I don't think not having conditions makes sense. I don't think it's meaningful. What I think is important is that it's coherent. You have different actors with different expertise. You have different conditions coming from the World Bank to that of the IMF. Neither is more or less important. They are important in their areas of expertise. If we thought that we just needed one set of actions, we would then give all our money to the IMF and it would be done. Or all our money to the World Bank and it would be done. So recognizing that, and that brings me back to the coordination that we did, especially last year among the IFIs, is really just to make sure that we focus on what is critical, most relevant, and that it is coherent. And then the other word that I introduced, which we normally don't talk about when it comes to conditionalities often, is the feasibility part. We have in our engagement for this year introduced a mid-year clause where we review the conditionality, recognizing that it is difficult to put up conditions for a whole year in a country that is undergoing war. So we have gone through one round, and we will do it soon again, to make sure that we deem, together with the Ukrainians, that the situation is feasible for every of the 20 actions we have. On corruption, and the risk for corruption, the risk for funds being misused. There are different systems. So the US, for example, have paid their support largely through the World Bank, which pays upon receipt. So you kind of know that their funds go to healthcare workers, to pensions, to hospitals, to what have you. We don't. We provide untied and undesignated support that goes into the budget and is meant to ensure macroeconomic stability at the time of the war, which means that we don't know exactly where the funds are going. So that makes it more important to build up a system in which the whole budget is relatively transparent and makes sense, that they have institutions that can control this themselves. We have had actions or conditions on selecting and appointing the head of the different corruption bodies, SAPO and NABU, in Ukraine, which is typically also something that the IMF has. There is typically overlap in this, and having actions from both also just show how important it is. So what is important is to all of us working in our own areas of expertise, where we bring value added, and make sure that taken together it is a coherent set of actions, and that they stay on what is the most important thing. On London and what do we expect? Yeah, so next week I will be in London. That will be, I'm sure, very interesting. I think one of the main messages that will come is don't wait until the war is over. Start to engage already now in the areas which is regions which is relatively more stable, in sectors which is relatively more predictable. What kind of support is needed is not for me as an EU bureaucrat to say. I would be wrong trying to pretend that I know. But there is a lot of work going on, and the EBRD is doing a fantastic job at this, and I would expect that something rather interesting comes out of it, but I'm not going to steal the limelight and that headline and pretend that this could be displayed already now. But I do think that there is an element of understanding up front. Private sector can go in, but might need a bit of a push, or might need a bit of support in so doing. And this, I think, is, if successful, what London can really be about. So very much private sector focus. The last thing is then maybe on the appetite for reforms. Well, I don't need to repeat in a way. I think you are very, very right in terms of when you have the back against the wall, you need to act. But I also would say that there is such a strong commitment among Ukrainians overall, not just the leadership, but among Ukrainians overall, to choose this European path, knowing that this comes with building up a future. And to some extent, they are now reforming by stealth, to some extent. I mean, when things are destroyed, they build, not back, but they build towards what they are seeking. So for me, the reform willingness is not always in par with the reform ability. And this is something I can see in quite a few other countries as well. But the willingness is not the problem. The ability sometimes is. That's also where technical support comes in. There's also where so it's not just that you put on conditions that they should do to get money, but you may need to help them to get them towards the European part. Accession negotiations would certainly help, but that also requires them to be sufficiently ready for that to be done. But until then, we work towards that path. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I think, a long way to go, but I think we have come quite far in the last 9 months, and certainly it is encouraging. Dmytro, Uma, Annika, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.